Does anyone have any questions about multiple regression that they want me to cover? Just give you folks a chance to. Is this the last week of tutorial? So this is the last week of live labs. I am around next week. There's no lessons planned, but I will hold live lab or drop-in labs if folks have questions about anything else. So yeah, this is the last week of a live lab, but I will be around at least for part of next week for drop-in help. Any other questions? Okay, seeing no other questions. I mean, if a question does come up, just feel free to type it into the chat box, but we'll get started. So last week, we worked through this running example, right? You know, what explains individuals' left-right ideological identity, right? So we had this dependent variable ideology, which is measured on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 means left, 10 means right. And we had various predictors, right? We had some demographic stuff, personal characteristics, gender, age, education, income. We also have some measures of substantive political orientations, right? So we had a measure of economic conservatism, we had a measure of social conservatism, and a measure of support for the carbon tax. And the economic conservatism question was, you know, this question, the government should leave it entirely to the private sector to create jobs. The social conservatism question was, society would be better off if fewer women worked outside the home. And both of these questions were, you know, one of those strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree questions, with strongly agree being 4 and strongly disagree being 1. And so as you move from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, you get increasing levels of either economically conservative values or socially conservative values. And then the carbon tax is simply this question, to help stop climate change, should the government increase the taxes on gas and heating oil by 10%, which is coded 1 if someone supports this hypothetical carbon tax, and 0 if somebody didn't support the carbon tax. And so we could run this full model in SPSS. And we won't bother running it because this is big, and we'll do another example model at the end here. But let's say, because when we went through the tutorial last week, right, we went through a few bivariate models, right, single predictors, and then calculated some predicted ideology scores. And then we did a trivariate example. Well, now I want to put all of these variables into the model and see which ones seem to be the most important. So if we were to redo this, this regression model, which you can do in SPSS, by the way, this is just the 2015 CES for tutorial data set. Yeah, you could run ideology as the dependent variable and all of these predictors, right? So first things first, let's look at this model summary table. We see that the R squared is 0.184, right? So, you know, this model is explaining 18% of the variation in ideology. So the other way to look at that is, if we know gender, age, education, income, governments, or economic conservatism, social conservatism, and support for a carbon tax, right? We can explain 18% of the variation in ideology using this set of variables. So certainly better than some of our bivariate models, but still a lot of room for improvement in terms of a comprehensive explanation for what causes people to identify ideologically in a certain way. Let's look now at the model results, right? And so we can look at the unstandardized coefficients. This allow us to make substantive interpretations, right? So the coefficient for gender is negative 0.064, right? So we know that's telling us that women, that the average woman is 0.6 of a point to the left of the average man. Similarly, income, there's a positive relationship here, right? So for every $10,000 that somebody makes, they move to the right by 0.03 of a point, right? So a slight relationship, but there's a relationship there. What does this 0.465 mean in substantive terms here? Does somebody want to take a crack at that? You can sort of type something into the chat box, or you can unmute your mic and say something. Let me put it this way. What is the difference between the most economically conservative person and the least economically conservative person in terms of ideology? Does anyone want to hazard a guess on how we might calculate that? So this question is measuring or is measured on a 4-point scale. The most conservative position is 4, and so just so the most economically conservative position is 4. Yeah. Let's do this. So that would be strongly agree with this statement. The government should leave it entirely to the private sector to create jobs. The least economically conservative position is equal to 1, right? And so this means we have a range of 4 minus 1, 3. So there's a gap of 3 points between the most economically conservative and the least economically conservative. So we can calculate using the coefficient 0.465 times 3, right? So the most economically conservative person, if we leave everything else being equal, is about 1.4 points out of 10 more conservative than the least economically conservative, right? So, if let's say if the average person is a 5 out of 10 on this left-right ideological scale, all else being equal, somebody who strongly agrees with the question, the government should leave it entirely to the private sector to create jobs, is going to be 1.395 points to the right of somebody who strongly disagrees with this question. And we can see, so this society would be better off if fewer women worked outside the home, right? So this is a measure of social conservatism, of traditional gender, belief in traditional gender norms. The coefficient here is 0.167. So it's about a third of the size of the coefficient of economic conservatism, right? And so another substantive claim that we can make using the results of this model is that someone's views on the economy are 3 times more important than their views on social matters when it comes to thinking about themselves on this abstract left-right spectrum. And so that's easy to compare the relative strength of 2 two independent variables, their relationship on the dependent variable, if they're measured on the same scale. But not everything is measured on the same scale. So these two questions are measured on the strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree scale. But income is measured in 10,000s. Education is simply, 1 to 4, where 1 is no post-secondary and 4 is a graduate or professional degree, right? And so we can look at the standardized coefficients, which convert all of these unstandardized coefficients, which have units attached to them. The standardized coefficients convert them all to z-scores, so that we can compare their relative impact on the dependent variable, because they have a common unit, which is z-scores now. And we see that, someone's views on the economy is still really strong, but it's not quite the strongest one, right? It's a little bit weaker than the standardized coefficient of support for a carbon tax, right? So if we look here, we can't really compare this unstandardized coefficient of 0.465 with this unstandardized coefficient of negative 1.004, because these two questions are measured in different units. But if we convert them to z-scores, we now have them in the same unit, which allows us to make a relative comparison between the two of them. The last thing that I wanted to point out on this table is, or are the significance values. And that's here, it says sig, right? So this is the significance value, or otherwise known as the p-value. And, again, in most social science, we tend to set thresholds of, 0.05. So that's the 95% confidence interval. Another way you might have heard that is, 19 times out of 20. And we see that most of these coefficients are significant at the 0.05 level, which means that their significance value, or their p-value, is less than 0.05. So the only one here that's not less than 0.05 is age. So the unstandardized coefficient is 0.006, so not a very large substantive effect, right? So for every increase of age by 1 year, somebody's, 6/1000ths of a point on a 10-point scale more conservative. Well, we look at the significance value of that, and the significance value, the p-value, is 0.172, which is much larger than 0.05. Now, if we had set a significance value of 0.01, then we really would only have 3 statistically significant predictors, and that would be income, economic conservatism, and support for the carbon tax. So even this social conservatism question, even though the effect is quite meaningful, if we had set a significance threshold of 0.01, 0.015 is larger than 0.01. So we would conclude that this is not statistically significant, or we can't be that confident that this average effect that we've measured is actually greater than 0. Any questions before we move on there? I'll keep thinking of any questions if you have any. I want to run through one final example, and we are going to use a different data set for this. And our example is what explains a country's level of development. So we can work through this one together, and that involves you having to go to D2L and go to the content section of POLI 399 and then data sets. If you prefer to do this on your own, you can just follow my screen. But if you want to follow along in SPSS, you can go to D2L, go to the data sets section of content, and we're going to use the country data set. So while folks are downloading that, I'm just going to introduce the problem here. And so this example research question that I gave you is, what explains a country's level of development? So the UN has the Human Development Index, and it's measured on a 0 to 100 scale. It's an index, so it's a composite indicator made up of several other measures, and it theoretically ranges between 0 to 100, where 0 is a country with absolutely no development, and 100 is the highest possible amount of development you could get, right? So in reality, no country is either 0 or 100, but that's just, they've constructed the scale so that it has this theoretical range between 0 to 100. And so there's a few possible predictors. I've mentioned 3 of them here. Income inequality, right? We might surmise or infer that countries with a higher level of inequality have lower levels of development, right? The idea that as a country increases in its development, it has the capacity to implement social assistance and welfare programs and a social safety net. Therefore, that would reduce income inequality. So there might be some relationship there. The level of democracy, right? We know that democracies don't tend to go to war, at least not with each other. And democracies tend to encourage the development of economies, the free flow of people, goods, and ideas. And so the level of democracy might, and the more democratic country is, sort of the less state corruption there would be. And so maybe democracy has something to do with that, right? And then regime stability. If a country is continually undergoing revolution, that's going to impede its level of development. And so, there's 3 measures here which you could make a case are correlated with development, and income inequality is measured using the Gini coefficient. The level of democratization is measured using the score POLI, and regime stability is measured using this variable called durable, which is simply the number of years since the last revolution. A revolution being defined as a major change in POLI score. I believe it's a change of 3 on the POLI scale. And we can look at the units here. So Gini is measured 0 to 100, with 100 being the highest level of inequality and 0 meaning the lowest level of inequality. POLI is -10 to +10, with 10 being the most democratic and -10 being the least democratic or most autocratic. And then durable is measured in years, from 0 to 191 years. So if you downloaded that dataset, you will see there are a lot of variables. And so just to get a little bit more practice with the interface, let's run a regression model together. So analyze, regression, linear. So again, let's analyze, regression, linear. And you can see I've already populated there. So I'll do this again. Our dependent variable is HDI 100. That's at the very bottom of the data set. And our independent variables, Gini 10 is at the very top of the variable list there. And then we're going to look for POLI. That's with the P's. So POLI, we'll move that over. And durable should be up with the D's. There you go, durable, in between district size and effectiveness. Right, so our dependent variable is HDI 100. Our independent variable is Gini 10, the Gini coefficient between 2000 and 2010. Another independent is the POLI score, and another independent is durability, or the number of years since the last revolution. And if we press OK, we'll see that it spits out this this table here. And I'm going to switch back to PowerPoint because I've already made some notes. So the model summary, let's sort of have a look at how good this model. So this model is explaining 39% of the variation, right? So income inequality, level of democratization, and regime stability explain 39% of the variation in a country's level of development. That's pretty good. Certainly better than a lot of simple models when it comes to political behavior. That's another reason I wanted to share this, because I know your assignment uses the country's subsample dataset, which is a subset of the one that we're working with. And, comparative and international politics analysis is always a little bit different from the behavioral tradition. So yeah, so R squared of 39. So these three variables explain 39% of the variation in a country's human development index score. And so we can write out our equation, right? The constant is 73.886. That goes in the constant there. The Gini coefficient, negative 0.517. So for every point increase in the Gini coefficient, right? Gini coefficient is a measure of inequality. So as inequality goes up, human development goes down, which makes sense, right? You want inequality to go down, and then that will mean development will go up, right? So, one point increase in the Gini in a country's Gini coefficient translates to a half point and change decrease in their level of development. Polity, positive 0.955. So for every point increase in a country's polity score, their HDI score goes up by almost a point, right? Goes up by 0.996 points. And then durability, right? A measure of regime stability, 0.232. So in substantive terms, for every year that a country has not had a revolution, its development index score will increase by 0.232 on average. Now, these are measures of the average relationship between each of these independent variables and our dependent variable. And so, if you think back to the lectures, where you were taking the mean of, the sample mean, that's an estimate of the average of a population, right? So this is the estimate of the average relationship between income inequality and a country's level of development, right? So some countries are going to be above average, some countries are going to be below average. This is an abstract model. And so in theory, if we sort of made this four-dimensional scatter plot, no country would be exactly on each of these lines that we would plot, right? And so how do we know that this is a true relationship and not something that's simply a statistical artifact, right? So we can look at the significance value. And in this case of this model, every single significance value, every single p-value is much less than 0.05, right? So not only are these coefficients substantively meaningful, but they're also statistically significant. So they're different from zero, which means that we can be confident that that's a real relationship and not one that's simply the product of statistical chance. Now we'll get to calculating substantive values here, but I want to just take a minute to compare the standardized coefficients, right? Obviously, the Gini coefficient is a 0 to 100 scale. Polity is a negative 20 to negative 10 to positive 10 scale. And then this is in number of years. So those units are all different. And so if we look at the standardized coefficients, we see that the variable with the largest standardized coefficient is durable, so it's regime stability. And so that seems to be the strongest predictor out of these three in terms of explaining a country's level of development. And then the other two variables are pretty close to each other in terms of size. They're different in direction, but polity seems to have a little bit stronger of a relationship with development than inequality, and obviously in different directions. So some substantive exercises that you can do. How much more or less developed is a country for every 15 years that a revolution hasn't taken place? What is the difference in development, and measured in HDI, between the highest and lowest scoring countries in terms of income inequality? And then same as above, what's the difference in development between the most democratic and the least democratic country? And so one way to do this is we can look at the descriptive statistics of each of these variables, right? So going back to our SPSS, we can do the descriptives command, which is the same thing as frequencies and adding the summary statistics, right? And so this gives us the minimum, maximum, and average, the mean, for each of these variables, right? And so this tells us that, first of all, our dependent variable ranges 14 to 93.8. And so again, no country is at the theoretical minimum or maximum. The Gini coefficient ranges from 24.7 to 74.3. So again, no country is absolutely unequal and no country is absolutely equal. Number of years since the last regime transition, right? There was one, there's countries which had a regime change the year before this survey was done. And there are countries which haven't had a regime change in 191 years. I think that's actually might be the United States or the UK. Then there are, for polity, we have the full range, -10 to +10, right? That's the full theoretical range. And so the answers to these questions, so for every 15 years, right? So the coefficient of polity, or for durability rather, here is 0.232, right? So this is the coefficient of durable, which is a measure of regime stability. Sorry, I'll put this here, durable. Right, so therefore the effect of 15 years of stability on HDI, right, is 15 years times the coefficient of durable. And so 15 times 0.232 is 3.48. So for every 15 years that a country hasn't had a revolution, we can predict an increase in human development score by 3.48 points. So the difference in development measured in HDI 100 between the highest and lowest scoring countries in terms of income inequality. Well, going back to our summary statistics, we know that the minimum Gini score is 24.7, the maximum is 74.3. The difference between the minimum and maximum is 49.6, and the coefficient of Gini is -0.517. So 49.6, the full range, times the coefficient of Gini, it equals -25.6 points. So the most unequal country, that's this country here, that's at 74. The most unequal country is 25.6 points less developed than the least unequal country, right? So, we're calculating, what do these regression coefficients mean in substantive terms? Similarly, for democratic development, level of democracy, right? The countries have the full range. And so the difference between -10 and 10 is 20. The coefficient of polity is 0.955. So the range times the coefficient tells us the most democratic country is 19.1 points more developed than the least democratic country. And so that just gives you a chance to, if you wanted to work through this yourself using the country data set, it gives you a chance to just, practice running regression models, practice interpreting them. And this is so important. Like for those of you who go on to either grad school, or if you do analytical work, at a research agency, for the government, at a think tank, that sort of thing. Regression is a very powerful technique, but a lot of people abuse it, and they just focus on, well, this coefficient is negative and statistically significant, and this coefficient is positive and statistically significant, and they don't go into the substantive interpretation. So, being able to do this stuff is pretty important. So, that's sort of the end of the live lab portion. Why don't we open it up for questions? Does anyone have any questions? This is a similar slide deck from last week. I've just added this another example using the country data sets. So I am gonna upload the revised slides if folks want to practice with that. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, seeing no questions, I think we'll leave it at that. It's been fun joining you guys for the last month here. Yeah, stay safe, have fun studying. I'm available for drop-in lab on Wednesday and Thursday at noon, and we'll probably do some drop-in labs next week as well. Yeah, so that's it. Watch out for this video on D2Well. And if there's no other questions, enjoy the rest of your day.